Hey guys, it's me, and today I'm here to do a review of Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines, directed by Jonathan Mostow, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, Nick Stahl, Claire Danes, Kristana Loken, and a few other people you may or may not recognize. What exactly brought about me wanting to talk about Terminator 3? I've been watching the Terminator films with my buddy who's also my roommate. Up until now, he's never seen any Terminator films. We just completed the first three, and we're about to advance on to Terminator Salvation and the other ones. And I've done a video on the first two films in a combined double feature review. Knowing that we were going to eventually watch Terminator 3, and after watching it again, I felt like giving my thoughts on the movie. And I hadn't seen it for a few years up until now, so I was wondering what would be my thoughts on it now, all these years later, and especially considering a lot of Terminator fans aren't really kind to this film, as well as the rest of the sequels after Terminator 2. And the wound is still a bit fresh from Terminator Dark Fate, so I wanted to see how this compared to Dark Fate. So let's talk about Terminator 3, and spoiler warning in case you haven't seen it. Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines takes place about 10 years after the events of T2. John Connor's living off the grid, has developed a drug problem, and works a string of a few odd jobs here and there. But then another Terminator, known as the TX, is sent from the future by Skynet to kill John Connor and his lieutenants, whilst another Terminator, a T-800 or a T-850 in this case, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, is sent back simultaneously to protect him and his future wife, Kate Brewster, played by Claire Danes. Despite seemingly having prevented Judgment Day in Terminator 2, John Connor's more or less convinced that the future has been changed, but there is a lingering fear in the back of his mind that he might not have been able to stop it after all. But his worst fears have come to fruition when everything that should have happened years ago is all starting to fall back into place, and he finds himself in a state of denial trying to stop it from happening. I remember at the time when Terminator 3 came out, I was ecstatic for it. I loved Terminator 1 and 2 as a kid, and I still do to this day. The summer of '03, I was 13 years old, and I didn't really follow movie news at the time. I followed like interviews with the cast members and all that stuff, but I wasn't really aware that not a lot of Terminator fans and general audiences were asking for a sequel, even though people were curious as to see like what was going to come of it had there been another sequel. And given how Hollywood tends to capitalize on a movie's success when it's really popular, it was inevitable that there was going to be a Terminator sequel. At the time of its release, it received an at best lukewarm response from critics and audiences. Terminator fans though, well, the consensus, as far as I can tell, especially today, is kind of all over the place. There's some who like it and some who think it's just or some people that just flat out hate it. Where do I stand on it? As a kid, I obviously loved it because, you know, it's Terminator and Arnold's back kicking butt and all that stuff. But today, 18 years later, I think it's a fine movie. It's entertaining, it's enjoyable, but it's not a great movie though. And we'll talk about some of the flaws in the review, but I don't think it's as bad as people have said it is. And especially after the last two Terminator movies we've had, this movie I think is miles better. Miles better than Dark Fate and Genesis. And I think it does a much better job of progressing the franchise forward after Terminator 2, despite all the faults that it has. I'm not blind to the faults, because they are there. So where do I start with Terminator 3? I've heard some people hold this reason against the film, saying that no fate but what we make for ourselves is completely rendered useless in this film, as well as the following sequels. Can't really disagree with you there. That being said though, if you want any more Terminator films after T2, it's something that you're gonna have to get over, because inevitably, as this movie tries to tell, that you can try to change your destiny, you can try to control your fate, but ultimately that fate's gonna catch up with you. And I do like the idea that they just postpone Judgment Day and that it's inevitable. This takes place in the year, I believe it was 2003 or 2004, I'm not really sure, but to my understanding, it's about a decade or so after the events of T2. As I said, John Connor's living off the grid, no phone, no address, which I think is a smart move. I would imagine he would have to have a failsafe just in case they didn't stop Judgment Day after all. And ultimately that's the case. And it's probably the closest that we're ever gonna get to seeing John Connor in a future where Judgment Day didn't originally happen, or at least didn't happen immediately. He feels that he's no longer the most important part of the human race, so he really has no idea what to do with his life. He's drifting aimlessly, and as he says, he keeps running as fast as he can to nowhere. I've always wondered what that would do to a person. If you're destined for something greater, and then ultimately you do something to stop it just because you don't want something horrible to happen, now you feel like you have no worth and you have no meaning in life. It kind of makes me wonder, at least, what does that do to a person? They don't really go that into it, because most of the movie he's just denying it and trying to push it all away, not ready to face what's coming. As opposed to balancing it out with, well, maybe it is inevitable. Maybe I should just embrace it and let it go, because there's no running away from it. Then we have Schwarzenegger returning as the T-101, or the T-850. Considering that this is an alternate timeline, I actually like that little detail that it's not strictly just a T-800, but it's also a slightly upgraded version of that model. Comes back in time in a time bubble, he gets biker clothes from a certain person, and the TX does a similar thing by stealing clothes off of this woman in Beverly Hills. Speaking of that, if you look at it through a very superficial lens, it's easy to look at this movie as a basic repackage of Terminator 2 and a slight one of Terminator 1. And while you could argue for something new, having seen the time travel stuff repeated in every single movie up until now, it plays out very differently. It's not the exact same thing as Terminator 2. Arnold doesn't get into a fight with bikers, the TX runs into a cop, but she doesn't steal his uniform. And as I said, John Connor has nobody to go back to, especially since his mother, Sarah Connors, passed away. And they also do later on try to stop Judgment Day from happening, but the end result is the complete opposite of what John Connor was hoping it would be. So yes, there are similar story beats and character moments, but they play on it in a very different way. The execution of that, well, that's debatable. And it also depends on what your preferences are as a person. I, for the most part, am okay with it. Even though there are moments where it's either cringe-inducing, or it's not as effective as it was in the previous two films, or there's a moment where it's the ultimate face-palming moment. The scene in the car where after the big crane sequence happens,
Sarah Connor, blowing up Cyberdyne, hasta la vista, baby, ring any bells?
Dude, you watched him die at the end of T2. Obviously, it's a different model. Since we mentioned John Connor, I'm pretty iffy on Nick Stahl personally as John Connor. Overall, I think he's fine as the character, but there's some moments where I just don't think he delivers as well. And he comes off as kind of a whiner. I'm not a leader, I never was, and I'm never going to be. We get it. You don't want to be a leader, but you can't run away from this. But then they also bring up the notion that the T-101 was specifically sent back by Kate Brewster in order to protect her and John Connor, because John Connor in the future was killed by the T-101. The reason for that is because Skynet was aware of the previous attempts to kill John Connor and used that particular model, and in that respect messed with John Connor's mind in order to get him to drop his guard. I think it's a cool idea, but ultimately in the long run, it doesn't go anywhere. Claire Danes, I would say, is fine as Kate Brewster, and I think she's a fine actress. I've seen bits and pieces of Homeland, which I would say is probably her most famous role, but she's also in Bill Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet by Baz Luhrmann. That was bad. That was bad. I'm sorry, Baz Luhrmann fans. It was not good. I'm sorry. She's been in a few other things also, but she's not really given a whole lot to do here. I like the idea of John having a wife and kids, which ultimately gives him something else to worry about other than his own safety. And considering that her father's an Air Force general who's in control of the Skynet program, to me it's pretty reasonable as to how John Connor was able to contact the US military remnants because of Kate Brewster's military connections. She also has a fiance who ends up getting killed by the TX. She starts off the movie very scared, not really sure of what's happening, until she sees her fiance, but then it's revealed to be the TX and morphs right in front of her, and she's finally realizing the reality of the situation. Other than that, though, there's really not much else to her character, and I felt like she was just kind of wasted here. And as I said earlier, there's quite a few moments in here where it's just cringe-inducing, such as the TX's line delivery of,
I like this car. I like your gun.
To me, it just comes off as forced and awkward and very robotic. I get it, essentially she's a robot, so she's not going to understand human interactions that well. The direction that Kristanna Loken was given for those lines didn't really work. But when she interrogates Kate Brewster asking, John Connor was here, where did he go? Those lines of dialogue I think actually make her really scary. And throughout the movie, she's actually pretty intimidating. She can morph herself into the physical form of another while also having a metal endoskeleton underneath. And she's able to form different weapons, go from a plasma gun to a flamethrower when it's damaged. And not to mention that she actually controls Arnold at one point to go after John Connor to kill him. And she beats Arnold to a pulp.
Was it fun kicking his ass?
Yeah, it was. It was fun.
To my recollection, I don't think Arnold had a problem with that at all, as he shouldn't. Does she hold a candle to the T-1000 and Arnold's T-800 in the first Terminator? No way. But with all the reasons I stated, I actually think that she's one of the better villains that we've seen in the Terminator franchise. Not the most memorable one, but I don't really think Kristanna Loken gets enough credit. And while it doesn't last too long in the movie, I do like the idea that she's sent back in time to eliminate John Connor's lieutenants. Her primary mission is to kill John Connor should she come across him, but if John doesn't have the lieutenants underneath him, there's not going to be much of an uprising. For once, it actually shows Skynet thinking outside the box for a change. Arnold as the T-101 is just as great as ever. And I do like the father-son bond that he and John Connor have is kind of turned on its head in a way. In the second film, it was a very endearing type of bond, given that John Connor was a kid. At this point in the series, he's a grown adult, and he should know better by now. He should know what to do and what not to do. And the T-101 doesn't exactly sugarcoat what he thinks John's supposed to do. And he has some really funny lines here, as usual. My database does not encompass the dynamics of human pair bonding. And in this movie, he's actually more of an underdog than he was in Terminator 2, because this TX is established as an anti-Terminator Terminator of sorts, given that Skynet anticipated the Resistance sending back another Terminator protector to protect John. And as he's explaining to John the different abilities that the TX has, like controlling other machines and driven by a plasma reactor of sorts, she's also a lot more intelligent than any other Terminator we've seen. And I love the fact that during one attack that she launches on Arnold, it damages one of his fuel cells, and it causes a small mini mushroom cloud when it explodes. I like how it sets up the fact that he eventually uses that last reactor in order to shove the cell into her mouth that blows up, killing her, with the line of,
"You are terminated."
As I've said throughout this video, there are some problems with this movie, but there's a lot of good in here too. There are times where the movie is really fun, like the crane truck sequence. That's probably one of the most underrated action pieces of that decade, especially when it's destroying all the cars on both sides of the street. That is absolutely ridiculous, especially when it scrunches up this one car into a ball. Ouch. Arnold firing the minigun while carrying the coffin on his shoulder is a nice callback to the second film, but not quite as effective. But then we have Kate Brewster's dad, who is in charge of the Skynet defense program, and they establish that there's a computer virus spreading across the internet. Unbeknownst to the military, it's actually Skynet preparing for its attack. And as he talks to his advisors throughout the movie, he's not really sure if he wants to launch Skynet, but ultimately he decides to do it, which effectively makes Skynet self-aware, and the events of Judgment Day are set in motion. In the ensuing chaos, the TX kills him, and he sends John, Kate, and the T-101 coordinates to Crystal Peak, which later turns out to be a fallout shelter. John Connor, though, has convinced himself that that's the system core for Skynet. Eventually, they manage to find their way over there. John and Kate go to the bottom of the shelter and discover that it's not the system core. And I think this ending is quite powerful, personally, because John has been in denial this whole movie about Judgment Day happening, and now that he realizes it's just a fallout shelter and that there really was no other way to stop it, and that his destiny was merely to survive the events, the radio transmission that he ends up receiving from military personnel that are reacting to the launch sequence by Skynet, and Nick Stahl's voiceover, I think is actually quite powerful. Very dour and depressing, but there's also a sense of hope. I'm gonna say it, it's, I think, an amazing ending. Oh, and one more thing. I like that they do mention in the movie that John and Kate had a romantic encounter when they were kids, right before the events of T2, and they were actually supposed to meet that day before all that chaos happened, and now here they are again all these years later. I think in a way it fits very nicely with the overall theme of this movie and how you try to run from your fate, but ultimately it's going to correct itself and catch up with you. So at the end of the day, Rise of the Machines, I would say, is not a great movie, but a fine sequel nonetheless. It's fun popcorn entertainment, and if you don't like the movie, I totally get it. But me personally, I would rather watch this over Genesis and Dark Fate any day of the week. Those are my thoughts on Terminator 3. What are your guys' thoughts on Terminator 3? Did you love it, like it, think it's alright, or do you hate it? Whatever the case is, comment below and tell me your thoughts, and I will see you all very soon.